looking at the two forms of linear equations, the slope-intercept is the one that's easiest to see your information, like your slope is m or your y-intercept is the constant. And then your x-intercept is always just going to be something comma 0, where that it's whatever x value and the y value is always 0. You can do that with the standard form, it's just harder to see the m and the b. In slope-intercept form, it's easy to see the slope and the y-intercept, like on number 1 here. You can tell that the slope is going to be 3 and the y-intercept is -7. The x-intercept, or where the line crosses the x-axis, is always going to have a coordinate of x, 0, something, 0. So if your question is, how do I find the x-intercept, then you just need to look where it has a y-coordinate of 0, so whatever that x is. If you look at number 1, if I know that it's going to be y is 0, I can plug in a 0 for the y value, and then that would equal 3x minus 7. So now I just solve it for what x is. I add 7 to both sides, I get 7 equals 3x, divide by 3 on both sides, and x is going to equal 7/3, so I could write that as a coordinate 7/3, 0. Remember that y value was 0, where the x value is 7/3. Okay, so now let's look at another example. Let's take number 2 here. I'll move number 3 out of the way. Number 2 has a different slope. It has a slope of -1/3 and a y-intercept of 4/3. Okay, you can see that. But again, the question is, how do I find the x-intercept? Remember, it's x, 0. So we know the y is 0, so we put 0 in where the y is, and then that would equal -1/3 x plus 4/3. So now we just solve for the x, and we can figure out what it is. You would subtract the 4/3 onto the other side. The 0 makes it really easy. -4/3 equals -1/3 x. Now to solve for x in one step, we could just multiply both sides of the equation by -3, and then we would have on this side the -3 would cancel out and the 3 would cancel out with it. Okay, so we would have 4 equals, and if we multiply this side by -3 also, the -3's would cancel out and we would have 1x. So x equals 4. And if we wrote that as a coordinate, it would be 4, 0. Okay, let's look at the third one here. If you notice, the y-intercept is half and the slope is 5, and to find the x-intercept we just need to find where the y is 0. So we just let 0 equal 5x plus half, and we would subtract half from both sides. So 0 minus a half is a -1/2, and that would equal 5x. Now when you're dividing here and you have a fraction already, move this over a little bit, you have to be careful, okay, about what you're dividing. So when you divide by 5, here 5 divided by 5 is 1, so we're left with just 1x. And when we divide 5 here, it's actually a -1/2 divided by 5, or in other words, times 1/5. So we get x equals -1/10. And that means our x-intercept would be -1/10, 0. Okay, now if the equation is in standard form, then what you want to do is you want to change it to slope-intercept form so that you can see the slope and the intercept and find the x-intercept easier. For example, if we have 3x plus 2y equals 7, then I would want to change it to where it's actually y equals. That way I could find my slope and my y-intercept really easily. So I'll go ahead and do it that way first, and then we'll look at working with it just in standard form. So I'll move the 3x to the other side, subtract 3x. So I have 2y equals -3x plus 7. And then I would divide everything by 2. And so now I've got y by itself. I have y equals -3/2 x plus 7/2. So my slope here is -3/2 and my y-intercept is 7/2. If you wanted to write the y-intercept as a coordinate, it would be 0, 7 halves. The x is 0 in this case. Okay, to find the x-intercept, we are just going to replace the y with 0. So it's 0 equals negative 3 halves x plus 7 halves, just like before. And now we would just solve that for the x. We'd subtract 7 halves from both sides, so we would have negative 7 halves equals negative 3 halves times x. Now, you always want to cancel out the denominators of the fractions, so here I can multiply everything by 2 or negative 2, and I'm going to go ahead and multiply by negative 2 so I can cancel out the negative signs. If I multiply negative 2 by negative 7 halves, I'm going to get positive 7, and if I multiply negative 2 times negative 3 halves, I'm going to get positive 3, so it'll be positive 3x. Then I just need to divide by 3, and I have x equal to 7/3. So my x-intercept then would be 7/3, 0. Alright, well, it's probably best to just put the line in slope-intercept form, because that's where you want to be able, that's how you can graph it easiest. You can see the slope. You can look for your y-intercept and your x-intercept in this equation. Okay, if we want to find the y-intercept first, then I'm going to replace the x with the 0. Notice that the x is 0 in the y-intercept. So I would put a 0 in here for x. So it would be 3 times 0, that would be 0. Basically, one of the terms is going to be canceled out, and so I would have 2y equals 7 left, and so really I could ignore this plus 0, and so I would just have to divide by 2, and I would get the y is equal to 7 halves. Now that's just when the x is 0. So that would be my y-intercept, 0, 7 halves. Now, if we wanted to take that same problem, and let me just move this up and I'll rewrite it, and we want to find the x-intercept, then remember my x-intercept is something, 0. So I'm replacing the y with the 0 to find the x-intercept. Remember, that's along the x-axis. So I'm putting a 0 in here for y, so it would be 3x plus 2 times 0 is 0. Okay, so that's basically gone, equals 7. So we can ignore the plus 0 again. So now I really just have 3x equals 7. So I would divide by 3 on both sides, and x equals 7/3. If you're just looking for the intercepts, that's really the easiest way to do it, is just go ahead and plug in your zeros, and you would have the x-intercept when you plug in a 0 for y, and a y-intercept when you plug in 0 for x.